The rancher thought he'd get rich from the lottery. Instead, he was given a captive Apache woman. John Mercer was a man who had always worked with his hands. From the time he was a boy, he had learned to ride horses, mend fences, and care for cattle. His family had owned a small ranch for generations. But in recent years, life had become harder. The land was dry, the cattle were fewer than they once were, and every season brought new worries. John loved the ranch, but he often found himself staring at the horizon, wondering how he would keep it alive. The drought had hit the region harder than anyone expected. Streams that once ran with water were now little more than dry sandbeds. The cattle were thin, and some had even wandered off in search of better grazing. John had tried everything he knew to protect the herd, but nature seemed to be against him. Bills were piling up, and creditors were starting to ask questions. Every day felt like a struggle just to stay afloat. One evening, while John sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the distant mesas, a neighbor rode up on horseback. He was carrying a small paper the kind people read aloud in town to share news. John squinted as the man handed it to him. It was a notice about a regional lottery, a chance to win a large sum of money. People were talking about it everywhere. Stories of winners who had changed their lives spread through town like wildfire. Some had bought new homes, others had started businesses, and a few had even traveled far from the dusty plains. John studied the paper carefully. He was skeptical. He had never believed in luck, only in hard work. But the temptation was strong. For months, he had watched his dreams of restoring the ranch fade. A sudden windfall could change everything. For the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of hope. He decided he would buy a ticket. Every evening after finishing his chores, John would sit by the small lamp in his cabin and write down numbers. He thought carefully, choosing ones that seemed meaningful to him. Some he picked for birthdays, others for dates of old memories. Every ticket represented a possibility, a dream that the ranch could survive, that he could pay off his debts, and maybe even help his parents live more comfortably in their old age. As the days passed, John's anticipation grew. He spoke to neighbors about the lottery, sharing stories of what he would do if he won. He imagined a new barn for the cattle, a larger house for the family, and a future without worry. Yet, the more he imagined, the more he felt a strange mixture of hope and anxiety. He knew the odds were against him, but hope is a powerful thing. It can make a man feel taller, stronger, and ready to face anything. The day of the lottery draw finally arrived. The town gathered around the small post office where the results were posted. John's heart raced as he approached the bulletin. People whispered excitedly, some cheering, some groaning in disappointment. John scanned the list carefully, and then he froze. He had won. Or at least he thought he had. But the prize was not what he expected. Instead of money, the notice stated that his reward was a person, a captive Apache woman. John's mind spun. He had imagined gold coins, maybe a new barn, not a human being. His first reaction was disbelief. Surely there was some mistake. How could a lottery give a human being as a prize? The thought was shocking, almost unreal. Neighbors noticed his confusion and whispered behind his back. Some laughed, some shook their heads in judgment, and others offered advice in a tone that suggested they expected him to know what to do. John felt a mixture of fear, shame, and responsibility. He had never dealt with such a situation before, and the moral weight of it pressed heavily on his chest. The woman's name was Nokomis, though at first, John only knew this from the brief description on the notice. She was said to be strong, intelligent, and wary of settlers. That much was clear from the way she had been described. and John realized that he could not treat her as a simple prize or reward. The thought of this weighed on him, and he spent the night pacing, unable to sleep. In the early morning, John prepared to meet Nokomis. He rode his horse to the place where she was being held, a small temporary holding area near the outskirts of town. As he approached, he saw her for the first time. She was calm, her dark eyes observing him carefully. Her posture was firm, proud, and unyielding. She did not speak at first, only watched. John felt a pang of guilt. Here was a human being, brought into his life by chance, not choice. He had to find a way to navigate this new reality carefully. At first, their interactions were cautious. Nokomis refused to accept anything from John that implied submission or ownership. She spoke little, and when she did, it was measured and deliberate. John found himself struggling to understand her, to bridge the gap between his world and hers. He realized quickly that brute force or authority would not work. Respect had to be earned, not demanded. Back at the ranch, life became a delicate balancing act. John had to continue caring for the cattle, repairing fences, and managing daily chores, all while learning how to live alongside Nokomis. She taught him about the land in ways he had never considered, where to find water, which plants could be eaten, and how to read the movements of animals. In return, John tried to offer her safety and food, though he often felt unsure whether he was doing the right thing. As days turned into weeks, John began to notice small changes. Nokomis was not merely surviving, she was observing, learning, and sometimes teaching. She moved with purpose, never passive, and slowly, John realized that the woman he had received as a prize was far stronger and wiser than he had imagined. This realization unsettled him. He had expected a reward, perhaps even admiration from his neighbors. Instead, he faced a challenge that tested his patience, his understanding, and his conscience. Word of the lottery prize spread quickly. Visitors came to the ranch, some curious, others judgmental. They asked questions, some polite, others not. John had to explain the situation repeatedly, and he noticed the mix of reactions. Some people admired his responsibility, while others whispered about scandal. John began to understand that his life would never be the same. The prize he had won was not money, but a chance to see the world differently, to confront his own assumptions, and to learn the value of respect, courage, and understanding. In the quiet moments, John would sit by the fire in the evenings and think. He remembered his dreams of wealth, of solving all his problems with a single lottery win. But now the dreams seemed smaller, almost trivial. He had been given something unexpected, something far more challenging than money. A living, breathing person with her own will, intelligence, and strength. The responsibility weighed on him, but it also stirred something he had not felt in years: humility and curiosity. John realized that life's fortunes could not always be measured in coins. Sometimes they came in forms that demanded patience, respect, and courage. Nokomis was no longer a stranger or a prize. She was a teacher, a mirror, and a companion in ways he did not yet fully understand. And though he did not yet know the path ahead, John sensed that his future would be shaped not by gold or silver, but by choices, understanding, and the strength of character. By the end of the first month, John felt a quiet shift in himself. The fear and confusion that had first gripped him were slowly replaced by respect and determination. He realized that the real challenge was not the lottery, the debts, or even the ranch. It was learning to live in a world that demanded empathy, courage, and understanding. Nokomis, silent and watchful, was at the center of this new lesson. And so, John Mercer began a new chapter of his life, not as a man chasing wealth, but as a man learning to navigate the complexities of honor, respect, and human connection. The ranch remained a place of work and struggle, but it also became a place of learning, growth, and unexpected insight. The lottery had brought him no gold, no easy fortune. Instead, it had given him something far more valuable, a living lesson in the ways of the world, and a person who would challenge him to become better than he had ever imagined. Life at the ranch settled into a routine, though it was far from easy. John Mercer had always been a hard-working man, but now he had to think about more than just the cattle, the fences, and the drought. He had Nokomis living on the ranch, and her presence changed everything. At first, John tried to treat her politely but cautiously, unsure of what to expect. He wanted to respect her, but he also feared her strength and intelligence. She was no ordinary person. She carried herself with dignity, and it was clear she had survived much in her life. Nokomis watched everything John did. She noticed how he managed the ranch, how he rode the horses, how he spoke to neighbors, but she also noticed the small things he could not hide, the weariness in his eyes, the worry about debts, the constant fear that the drought would claim everything he had. At first, she spoke little, giving nothing away. Her silence was not rude, it was careful. She was observing, learning, and deciding how to act. John, in turn, felt both frustration and fascination. He had never met anyone like her. The first few weeks were tense. John wanted her to understand that she was safe on the ranch, but he struggled to communicate without sounding commanding. Nokomis refused to be treated as property, and she made it clear through her actions. She would not take food or shelter unless it was offered with respect. She would not follow orders unless she agreed they were reasonable. Every day, John had to think carefully about how to act. It was exhausting, but it was also a lesson in patience he had never learned before. As time passed, small moments of understanding began to emerge. Nokomis showed John how to find water in the dry land. She pointed out plants that were safe to eat and ones that could be used for medicine. She taught him how to track animals, not just by their footprints, but by the signs of their movement, the broken twigs, the flattened grass, the subtle disturbances in the soil. John realized that she had skills he had never thought to learn, and he began to rely on her knowledge. John also began to talk to Nokomis in ways he had never spoken to anyone. He shared stories of his childhood, the ranch, and his family. At first, she listened quietly, her expression calm and unreadable. Then, slowly, she began to share her own stories. She told him about her family, about her tribe, about the struggles and dangers she had faced. John listened with a mixture of awe and regret. He had always thought of settlers and natives as opposing sides, but hearing her story made him understand the complexity of the world. It was not a simple matter of right and wrong. There were human lives on both sides, and suffering everywhere. Neighbors began to notice the unusual partnership developing at the ranch. Some were curious, some judgmental. They whispered about John receiving a prize from the lottery, and they wondered why he had not simply turned Nokomis over to someone else. John ignored the gossip as best he could, but it weighed on him. He realized that protecting her was not just a matter of safety, it was a matter of principle. He could not betray the trust that was slowly forming between them. Life, however, was never simple. One day, while checking the fences near the edge of the property, John spotted a small group of men approaching. They were strangers, rough-looking and impatient, and John could tell from their expressions that they were looking for trouble. Nokomis noticed them too, and without a word, she moved closer to John, her stance protective. John realized that their world had just become more dangerous. The men demanded to know about Nokomis. They had heard stories about the prize and wanted to take her for themselves. John felt a surge of anger and fear. He knew he had to act carefully. He could not underestimate them, but he also could not give in. For the first time, he realized how serious the situation had become. This was no longer just about a lottery or a strange reward. This was about safety, loyalty, and courage. Nokomis took the lead. She spoke to the men calmly, without fear. Her words were measured, but her eyes were sharp. She made it clear that she would not be taken against her will. The men were surprised. They had expected submission, but Nokomis gave none. John felt a deep respect for her in that moment. He realized that she was not only strong and intelligent, but also brave. Her courage gave him the strength to stand firm. After the strangers left, John and Nokomis spent hours discussing what had just happened. John realized that he could no longer see her as a captive or a prize. She was a partner, a teacher, and a person he had to respect fully. The lesson was clear. Life could not be controlled by desire alone. Strength, wisdom, and courage were just as important as wealth or power. Nokomis had taught him something he could never have learned from books or neighbors. As the weeks passed, John's respect for Nokomis deepened. He began to see her not just as someone to protect, but as someone whose skills and intelligence made the ranch stronger. She showed him how to repair the fences more efficiently, how to manage the cattle in a drought, and how to anticipate dangers that he had once ignored. Slowly, John realized that he had underestimated the value of knowledge that came from experience rather than schooling or inheritance. John also noticed changes in himself. He had once believed that wealth was the key to happiness and security. Now he understood that real value lay in human connection, understanding, and trust. Nokomis had no gold or silver, but she had something far more precious: courage, wisdom, and dignity. These were qualities that money could never buy, and John felt a deep gratitude for having her in his life. One morning, while checking on the cattle, John realized that Nokomis had begun to influence the way he thought about his neighbors and the world around him. He noticed injustices he had once ignored, small and large, and began to question what he had accepted as normal. Her presence had opened his eyes to a larger world, one filled with both danger and opportunity, cruelty and compassion. Despite the growing trust between them, John knew that life would never be simple. The world outside the ranch was still dangerous, and there were many who would see Nokomis as a prize or a tool. He had to be vigilant, but he also had to learn how to respect her independence while keeping her safe. Every decision he made carried weight, and every action required thought. John realized that this was perhaps the most important lesson he could ever learn. Life demanded responsibility, understanding, and courage in equal measure. The bond between John and Nokomis grew slowly. They shared small victories, like saving a calf stuck in the mud or finding water during a dry spell. They shared quiet evenings by the fire, talking about the past and the future. Sometimes they argued, each testing the other, each asserting their independence. But every argument ended with a deeper understanding, a mutual respect that grew stronger day by day. John's neighbors continued to talk. Some mocked him, others admired him quietly, but John no longer cared about their opinions. He had found a new sense of purpose and understanding, and it was more valuable than any money or approval he could receive. Nokomis had become a guide, a teacher, and a friend in ways he had never imagined. As the months passed, John reflected on how much he had changed. He had come to the lottery expecting wealth, but instead he had received something far more complex and rewarding. Life had given him a challenge, and through it, he had grown. Nokomis had taught him lessons about courage, wisdom, and respect that no amount of money could ever provide. In the quiet moments, John would watch her work, silently admiring her skill and strength. He realized that the true fortune of life was not in gold or silver, but in the people who challenge us, teach us, and inspire us. Nokomis had done all three, and John felt a deep sense of gratitude and humility. By the end of the second part of their story, John Mercer was no longer the man who had dreamed of easy wealth. He had become someone who understood the value of courage, respect, and human connection. Nokomis, once a stranger and a prize, had become a teacher and a partner in a journey that would shape both of their lives. Together, they faced the challenges of the land, the dangers of the world, and the lessons that life demanded, learning that sometimes the greatest rewards come in forms that are unexpected, difficult, and profoundly meaningful. The days at the ranch continued, but life was no longer simple. John Mercer had begun to understand the depth of Nokomis' knowledge and skill, but with every lesson came new challenges. The land was harsh and unpredictable, and the outside world remained just as dangerous. There were moments when the sun beat down with relentless heat, drying up water sources, and moments when sudden storms threatened to wash away the fences and flood the lowlands. Yet these hardships also became a way for John and Nokomis to learn from each other. One morning, John woke before sunrise. The desert air was cool, and the faint sound of cattle lowing carried across the ranch. He noticed that Nokomis was already awake, moving quietly near the water trough. She had discovered a small, hidden spring that John had never noticed before. It was a clever find, and it reminded him that her skills were more than survival. They were insight into life itself. He watched her work, carefully directing the water into channels so the cattle could drink without wasting the precious resource. John realized that he had spent years relying only on his own knowledge, but Nokomis had opened his eyes to a deeper understanding of the land. Nokomis did not just teach practical skills. She also taught John patience and observation. She would ask him to notice small details, the tracks of a coyote in the sand, the patterns of wind through the grasses, the way clouds moved before a storm. At first, John felt impatient. He was a man used to hard work and action, not careful watching. But slowly he began to see the value of this attention. The land spoke to those who listened, and Nokomis was a master listener. As the seasons changed, John and Nokomis's relationship deepened. They began to rely on each other in ways that neither had expected. John had once believed that wealth and power were the keys to safety, but now he understood that knowledge, trust, and respect were even more important. Nokomis had become his guide in both the physical and moral challenges of the ranch. She taught him to read people as well as the land, showing him that strength was not just in muscle, but in courage, intelligence, and wisdom. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and red, Nokomis shared a story of her past. She spoke of her family, of the tribe that had raised her, and of the struggles they had faced against settlers who did not understand their ways. John listened in silence, feeling a mixture of awe. He had grown up hearing only one side of the story, and now he realized how much he had misunderstood. Her words carried weight, and John felt the beginnings of true empathy. He understood that the world was more complex than he had imagined, and that true courage often meant protecting those who could not defend themselves. But peace on the ranch was fragile. News of Nokomis' presence had spread, and not all who heard the story had good intentions. One morning, John noticed fresh tracks near the edge of the property, tracks that did not belong to his cattle or neighbors. He followed them carefully, heart pounding. Nokomis joined him, moving silently, alert to every sound and movement. The tracks led to a group of men, strangers from a neighboring settlement, who were searching for her. They had heard the stories and thought she could be taken as a prize or used for bargaining. John felt a surge of fear and anger. He had faced many challenges before, but this was different. These men did not understand Nokomis's strength, and they underestimated the bond between them. He realized that he could not rely on force alone. He needed strategy, careful planning, and trust in Nokomis's knowledge. Together, they returned to the ranch, devising ways to protect the cattle, the land, and themselves. The days that followed were tense. John and Nokomis reinforced fences, set up warning signals, and prepared for any possible intrusion. Nokomis taught John how to move quietly, how to observe without being seen, and how to anticipate the actions of those who might harm them. John, in turn, used his knowledge of the ranch and the terrain to create safe paths and hiding spots. Their partnership became a dance of strategy and trust, each learning from the other, each relying on the other in ways neither had expected. During this time, John began to notice changes in himself. He was no longer the man who dreamed only of wealth. His priorities had shifted. He cared more about safety, integrity, and understanding than about coins or land value. Nokomis had taught him lessons that went beyond survival. She had shown him that respect and trust were more valuable than money, and that courage was measured not by force, but by the willingness to do what was right, even when it was difficult. One afternoon, while checking on the cattle, John noticed signs that the strangers were returning. Nokomis quickly assessed the situation and led him to a hidden vantage point. From there, they could observe without being seen. The men moved cautiously, unaware of the careful eyes watching them. Nokomis whispered instructions, and John followed them without hesitation. He realized that her guidance had become essential to his survival, and he trusted her completely. As the tension mounted, John understood that their partnership had grown beyond necessity. It was no longer just about survival. It was about mutual respect and understanding. He had learned to listen, to observe, and to value Nokomis's wisdom. She had taught him lessons he could never have learned alone, and he knew that their bond was stronger than fear or danger. The situation reached a climax when the strangers attempted to approach the ranch directly. John and Nokomis were ready. Using the skills they had developed together, they set up defenses and prepared for confrontation. But it was not violence that won the day. It was strategy, patience, and intelligence. They anticipated every move, and the strangers eventually retreated, realizing they were outmatched not by weapons, but by knowledge and cunning. After the danger had passed, John felt a profound sense of relief. He looked at Nokomis, and for the first time he truly saw her as an equal. She had not only saved herself, but had taught him how to face the world with courage and wisdom. The experience had changed him. He understood that life's true challenges were not always visible, and that strength came in many forms. In the quiet evenings that followed, John and Nokomis would sit by the fire reflecting on the events of the day. They shared stories, plans, and hopes for the future. John realized that he had grown in ways he never imagined. Nokomis had opened his eyes to a new understanding of life, teaching him that respect, courage, and wisdom were far more valuable than wealth or social approval. The bond between them deepened. They worked together, learned together, and faced dangers together. John began to understand the full weight of responsibility, not just for the ranch, but for the people and the world around him. Nokomis had become more than a teacher. She was a partner, a guide, and a friend. Through her, John had discovered the meaning of true courage and integrity. As the seasons changed, the ranch began to thrive again. The cattle were healthier, the fences stronger, and the land better managed. But John knew that the real growth had happened within himself. He had learned to value wisdom over wealth, respect over power, and courage over fear. Nokomis had shown him a way to live that was rich in understanding and connection, and he felt grateful for every lesson. By the end of this period, John Mercer was no longer the man who had once dreamed of a lottery prize. He had found something far more valuable: a deeper understanding of the world, respect for another person's knowledge and strength, and the courage to face challenges with integrity. Nokomis, once a stranger and a prize, had become a teacher, a guide, and a partner in a journey that would continue to shape both of their lives. The story of John and Nokomis showed that true fortune is not measured in gold or wealth. It is measured in the lessons we learn, the trust we earn, and the courage we develop when faced with unexpected challenges. Together, they faced a world that could be harsh and unforgiving, learning that survival, understanding, and respect were the greatest rewards life could offer. The peace that John and Nokomis had worked so hard to build on the ranch did not last long. Life in the desert was always unpredictable, and humans were often more dangerous than the storms or droughts. One morning, while John checked the fences, he noticed smoke rising from the horizon. At first, he thought it might be a controlled burn or a passing traveler's fire, but the smell of burning grass and the unusual movement of dust told him that this was no ordinary fire. Something was wrong. He rode quickly toward the smoke, and Nokomis followed silently behind, her eyes scanning every movement in the dry grass and rocky hills. As they approached, they saw the reason for the smoke. A small group of men, outsiders, were approaching the ranch. They were not neighbors, and they carried tools and weapons that suggested trouble. John's heart sank. He had feared this day might come. Word of Nokomis's presence had spread, and some men still believed she could be taken as a prize or used to gain favor with powerful people in town. Nokomis was calm, though her eyes were sharp and alert. She did not speak, but John could feel her mind working. She had faced danger before, and she had learned how to read people quickly. She signaled John to hide the cattle and to take cover. Using the skills she had taught him, they moved swiftly and silently, preparing for a confrontation that they both knew could be dangerous. The men approached the ranch, shouting demands and accusations. They believed John had been dishonest in receiving Nokomis from the lottery, and they thought they had the right to take her. John's first instinct was anger. He wanted to confront them with force, but he remembered Nokomis's lessons about strategy and patience. Acting recklessly could endanger them both. He took a deep breath and listened to Nokomis as she quietly directed their next moves. Together they set up traps and warning systems, using the natural landscape to their advantage. Nokomis led John to hidden vantage points where they could watch the men without being seen. She showed him how to predict their movements based on small clues, footprints in the sand, broken twigs, and the direction of the wind. John marveled at her intelligence and her ability to stay calm under pressure. It was clear that Nokomis's experience and wisdom were just as valuable as any weapon. The confrontation began in the late afternoon. As the sun cast long shadows across the desert, the men grew frustrated when they could not find Nokomis or the cattle. John and Nokomis moved silently, observing their movements and waiting for the right moment. Nokomis whispered instructions, and John followed them without hesitation. Every step required careful thought, and every decision could mean the difference between safety and disaster. Hours passed with tense silence, broken only by the distant shouts and occasional clatter of tools. The men grew tired and careless, assuming that their targets would be easy to find. But John and Nokomis were patient. They had learned that strength alone was not enough. Intelligence and strategy could accomplish what brute force could not. Finally, when the men were exhausted and distracted, John and Nokomis acted. Using a combination of careful maneuvers and clever distractions, they led the men away from the ranch, guiding them toward terrain that was difficult and confusing. The men stumbled, argued, and eventually gave up, realizing that they had been outsmarted. They left, grumbling and defeated, leaving John and Nokomis safe for the moment. John felt a surge of relief, but he also felt admiration for Nokomis. Her courage, skill, and intelligence had saved them both. After the danger had passed, John and Nokomis returned to the ranch. The cattle were safe, and the fences were intact. They sat together in the shade, exhausted but relieved. John realized that he had grown in ways he had never expected. He had learned to listen, to observe, and to rely on someone other than himself. Nokomis had become not just a partner in survival, but a teacher in courage, wisdom, and trust. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a careful routine. John worked the land, repaired fences, and cared for the cattle, while Nokomis continued to teach him about the desert, the plants, the animals, and the people who lived in the area. She also continued to share stories of her tribe, helping John understand the world from a perspective he had never considered. He listened closely, learning lessons about empathy, morality, and the consequences of human actions. Despite the progress, John knew that threats were never far away. The outside world was unpredictable, and some people still believed that Nokomis could be taken or controlled. He felt a responsibility to protect her, not as a task or a burden, but as a matter of principle. He could not let others treat her as a prize or an object. He had seen her courage, intelligence, and dignity, and he understood that these qualities were more valuable than any wealth or status he could imagine. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, John reflected on how much his life had changed. He had once dreamed of winning the lottery and becoming rich, imagining that money could solve all his problems. Now he realized that wealth was meaningless compared to the lessons he had learned from Nokomis. She had taught him patience, strategy, courage, and respect. She had shown him that true strength comes from knowledge, understanding, and moral integrity. Nokomis, too, had learned from John. She had seen that not all settlers were cruel or ignorant. Some, like John, could learn, grow, and change. She had also learned that patience and careful strategy could achieve more than anger or force. Their partnership was no longer just about survival. It had become a relationship based on mutual respect, trust, and shared goals. As the months passed, John and Nokomis continued to strengthen the ranch and their bond. The cattle flourished under careful management, the fences were repaired and reinforced, and the land was slowly thriving again. But more importantly, John had grown into a man who understood the value of courage, wisdom, and human connection. Nokomis had become a central part of his life, not as a prize or a possession, but as a trusted partner and friend. The events of the past months had changed John profoundly. He no longer measured life by wealth or success alone. He measured it by lessons learned, challenges overcome, and the strength of relationships built on respect and trust. Nokomis had taught him that courage was not just about facing danger, but about facing the truth, making difficult choices, and acting with integrity. In the quiet evenings, John and Nokomis would sit together, sharing stories and plans for the future. They discussed ways to improve the ranch, to better understand the land, and to protect themselves from future threats. Every day was a new lesson, and every challenge brought them closer together. John had come to value Nokomis's wisdom and perspective above all else. One day, John realized that he had changed more than the ranch had. He was no longer the man who had dreamed of easy wealth from the lottery. He was a man who understood responsibility, courage, and respect. He had learned to see beyond his own needs, to consider the well-being of others, and to face the dangers of the world with intelligence and patience. Nokomis had been the guide, the teacher, and the companion who had brought him to this understanding. By the end of this chapter in their lives, John and Nokomis had faced danger, learned from each other, and built a partnership based on trust, respect, and courage. They had defended the ranch from outsiders, survived the harsh desert, and grown stronger together. John understood that life's true wealth was not measured in money or possessions, but in knowledge, friendship, and the courage to do what is right. The story of John Mercer and Nokomis showed that the greatest challenges can bring the greatest lessons. Through danger, patience, and understanding, they had learned that survival was more than just living. It was about learning, growing, and respecting the people and the world around them. They had faced tests that would have defeated others, and they had emerged stronger, wiser, and more connected than ever before. As the sun set on the desert, John watched Nokomis move among the cattle, confident and capable. He realized that he had been given a gift far greater than gold or wealth. He had been given the opportunity to learn, to grow, and to form a bond with someone extraordinary. Nokomis had transformed his life, and in turn, he had begun to understand the true meaning of courage, respect, and human connection. Life on the ranch had settled into a rhythm, but it was no longer ordinary. John Mercer had grown from a man who once dreamed only of wealth into someone who understood responsibility, courage, and respect. Nokomis had become more than a companion. She was a teacher, a guide, and a partner in every sense. Together they had survived dangers, learned the secrets of the land, and faced the harsh realities of the desert. Now, they were beginning to build something more lasting, something neither of them could have imagined when John had first won the lottery. The cattle were thriving, the fences were strong, and the land, though still harsh, had been managed in a way that made it productive again. John had learned to pay attention to the smallest details, thanks to Nokomis's teachings. He could read the sky, follow tracks, and anticipate the movements of animals in ways he had never known before. Nokomis had taught him patience and observation, skills that were now as valuable as any tool or weapon. Every corner of the ranch bore the mark of their combined work, a silent testament to the lessons they had learned together. But more than the land, it was the human connection between John and Nokomis that had changed everything. The bond they had built was based on mutual respect and trust, not on fear or control. John had come to understand that life's true wealth was not in coins or property, but in relationships, in courage, and in understanding. Nokomis had shown him a way to live that was rich in meaning and purpose, and he was grateful for every lesson she had shared. One morning, while inspecting a distant fence line, John realized just how far they had come. The sun was rising, painting the desert in shades of gold and red. Nokomis was already at work, moving among the cattle with calm confidence. She noticed a weak calf and guided it gently to a safe area with water and shelter. John watched her for a long moment, feeling a mixture of admiration and humility. He knew he could not have managed this ranch alone, and he understood that the real value of life lay in shared effort, trust, and understanding. Their partnership had also changed the way the local community saw them. At first, neighbors had whispered and gossiped about the strange prize John had received from the lottery. Some were critical, others merely curious. But over time, as people saw John and Nokomis work together, they began to respect them. They noticed the intelligence, patience, and courage it took to manage the ranch successfully, and they began to understand that Nokomis was not a prize or possession, but a person of remarkable strength and character. John often reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He remembered the excitement of the lottery, the shock at the prize he had received, and the months of struggle and learning that followed. He had imagined wealth, but what he had received instead was something far more valuable: wisdom, trust, courage, and a living connection with another human being.
What?
Nokomis had changed his life in ways he could never have predicted, and he understood that some lessons could only be learned through experience and patience. The seasons continued to pass, each bringing new challenges and opportunities. The winter was harsh, with biting winds and cold nights, but John and Nokomis faced it together, using the skills they had learned to keep the cattle safe and the ranch functioning. Nokomis taught John how to preserve food, how to find shelter, and how to anticipate changes in the weather. Her experience was invaluable, and John's respect for her grew with every lesson. In turn, John began to teach Nokomis some of the skills he had learned growing up on the ranch. He showed her how to repair fences more quickly, how to manage cattle during breeding season, and how to plan for long-term survival. Their partnership became a true collaboration, each contributing knowledge and skill, each learning from the other. The ranch was no longer just a place to work. It was a school, a home, and a symbol of what they could achieve together. One afternoon, while repairing a section of fence that had been damaged in a recent storm, John paused to watch Nokomis guide a group of cattle through a narrow passage. He felt a deep sense of admiration and gratitude. She had taught him more than survival skills. She had taught him how to see the world differently, how to value courage, knowledge, and integrity above all else. He realized that he had been given a rare opportunity to grow into a better man, and it was Nokomis who had led the way. The true test of their partnership came when a traveling merchant passed through the area, spreading rumors about a prize on John's ranch. The merchant tried to stir trouble, claiming that Nokomis had been taken unfairly and that John had no right to keep her. John faced a difficult choice. He could have avoided confrontation, but he knew that doing so would betray the trust and respect he had built with Nokomis. He chose instead to stand firmly by her side, defending her not as property but as a partner and equal. The confrontation was tense, but it ended without violence. The merchant saw the strength of their bond and the intelligence with which they managed the ranch. He realized that Nokomis was not a prize to be taken, but a person whose courage and skill commanded respect. He left quietly, and John and Nokomis returned to their work, knowing that they had faced another challenge together and had emerged stronger. As the months and years passed, the ranch continued to thrive. John and Nokomis faced dangers, storms, and challenges, but they always faced them together. They learned to anticipate problems, to rely on each other, and to value the knowledge and courage that each brought to their partnership. John had learned lessons that no amount of wealth could ever teach him: patience, observation, respect, and the courage to do what is right, even when it is difficult. Nokomis, too, had grown through their partnership. She had seen that not all settlers were cruel or greedy, and she had learned that trust and cooperation could lead to safety and success. She had taught John to see the world through a lens of understanding and respect, and in doing so, she had helped him become a better man. Their lives were intertwined, not by chance or circumstance, but by mutual respect and shared experience. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with deep orange and purple hues, John and Nokomis sat together by the fire. The ranch was quiet, the cattle settled, and the fences secure. They spoke of the past, of the lessons they had learned, and of the future they hoped to build. John realized that the journey that had begun with a lottery prize had transformed his life completely. He had learned that true wealth is not in gold or silver, but in knowledge, courage, and human connection. They planned for the future together, discussing ways to improve the ranch, to manage the land more effectively, and to ensure that both of them could continue to live safely and honorably. Every decision was made with care and respect, reflecting the lessons they had learned about patience, observation, and trust. John knew that life would always have challenges, but he also knew that they could face them together, stronger than either could be alone. By the end of this chapter in their lives, John Mercer was no longer the man who had dreamed of wealth and lottery fortune. He had gained something far more valuable: wisdom, courage, respect, and a deep understanding of human connection. Nokomis had transformed his life, showing him that true strength is measured not by power or money, but by the ability to face challenges with integrity, to learn from others, and to act with courage. It was no longer just a piece of land or a place of work. It was a testament to what could be achieved through trust, respect, and cooperation. The challenges they had faced together had strengthened their bond and taught them lessons that would last a lifetime. John often reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The lottery had promised wealth, but it had delivered something far richer: the chance to learn, to grow, and to build a life based on courage, respect, and understanding. Nokomis had been at the center of this transformation, teaching him lessons that money could never buy. As the sun set over the desert, John watched Nokomis move among the cattle. Calm and confident, he realized that he had been given a gift far greater than any treasure. He had been given the opportunity to grow into a better man, to learn lessons that would last a lifetime, and to form a partnership based on trust, respect, and courage. Nokomis had changed his life forever, and he was grateful for every moment they had shared. In the quiet of the evening, surrounded by the vast desert and the peaceful ranch, John Mercer understood the truth. Life's greatest fortune is not wealth or power. It is wisdom, courage, respect, and the human connections that shape us, challenge us, and help us grow. He had found his fortune not in a lottery prize, but in the strength, wisdom, and courage of Nokomis, the woman who had changed his life forever.